Here's the thing, nobody tells you about this book. It's not a book about winning. It really isn't. Everyone sells you this idea that Thus Spoke Zarathustra is some kind of manual for becoming a superior version of yourself. The whole self-help angle, confidence, power, standing above the crowd, that's the marketing, right? That's the thumbnail version, and it's so far from the truth. But open the actual book, and here's what you find in the first 30 pages. A man comes down from a mountain after 10 years alone, carrying what he thinks is the most important gift he's ever going to give humanity. He's totally convinced of it. He walks into a town, he starts talking, and the crowd laughs at him. They just laugh. Not once. Over and over, through the whole book, Zarathustra tries to teach people something true, and almost nobody listens. He fails in public, repeatedly. He gets mocked, ignored, misunderstood by his own followers. And here's the detail that never makes it into these summaries. Nietzsche wrote this while he was, in almost every sense, alone, rejected by the one woman he proposed to, estranged from his sister, broke, unable to get publishers to take the later sections seriously. He ended up paying to print part 4 himself in a tiny run because no one else would touch it. So before we even get into the ideas, sit with that. This is a book about being unheard, written by a man who was, at the time, mostly unheard. That's not a footnote. That's the whole emotional architecture of the thing. Now, if you've heard this book is about becoming an Ubermensch and just leave it there, you're going to miss what's actually underneath. Stick with me, because the parts nobody talks about are the parts that actually explain why this book still wrecks people over 100 years later. And it completely reframes how you approach the book once you realize the man holding the pen was writing from a place of profound social and physical wreckage. Wreckage is genuinely the right word for it. In the early 1880s, Friedrich Nietzsche's life had just imploded. His health was a catastrophe, blinding migraines that would leave him vomiting in darkened rooms for days, alongside severe chronic stomach problems. Because of this, he actually had to resign from his prestigious position as a philology professor at the University of Basel. He lost his career and ended up living on a tiny pension, wandering between cheap, unheated rented rooms in Italy and Switzerland, basically just looking for a climate that wouldn't cause him physical agony. On top of that, there was the intellectual and romantic heartbreak. He had fallen deeply for a brilliant young woman named Lou Salomé, proposed to her, and was rejected. That situation devolved into a horrific falling out, not just with her, but with his close friend Paul Ree. It sparked a bitter, vicious feud with his own mother and his fiercely anti-Semitic sister, Elizabeth. He was completely, totally isolated. Now try to square that reality with the popular conception of his work. We're told he's the philosopher of raw power, the ultimate dominator, of dominating your circumstances. But that's a guy who can barely get out of bed, who lost his friends, who can't get a date, and who is literally self-publishing his magnum opus for a handful of people because the actual publishing houses basically said, "No thanks, this is weird." So, how does a philosophy of supreme strength come out of someone who is fundamentally failing at everyday life? Isn't there a massive contradiction there? Why start a grand philosophical epic with your hero falling flat on his face? Because Nietzsche is explicitly rejecting the traditional model of a teacher or a savior. Think about classical religious books. The prophet comes down from the mountain, speaks the truth, and the world is fundamentally altered. The masses are awed, the parting of the Red Sea kind of stuff. Nietzsche looks at the modern world and says, well, that's not how it works anymore. We live in an era where profound truths are drowned out by noise and distraction. Zarathustra doesn't fail because his ideas are weak. He fails because he misunderstands the audience. He assumes that because he has discovered something earth-shattering, humanity is waiting with open ears. It isn't. Nietzsche structures this opening to demonstrate a crucial psychological reality, which is that you cannot just hand someone a transformative truth. They have to be ready to suffer for it, and people don't want to suffer. The masses in the marketplace are not looking to suffer. They are looking to be entertained. So let's start where the book actually starts. Not with a lecture, with a death. Zarathustra walks into a marketplace to give his first public speech. A crowd is gathered, but not for him. They're there to watch a tightrope walker cross a wire strung between two towers. They're waiting for a show. Zarathustra starts speaking anyway. He tells them about something he calls the Overman, this idea of the human being as a bridge, not a destination. And the crowd doesn't care. They're completely bored. They want the show. Then it happens. A jester leaps onto the rope behind the tightrope walker, taunts him, and the tightrope walker loses his footing. He falls. He crashes into the ground right in front of Zarathustra, dying almost instantly. And here's what almost every summary skips. The crowd scatters. They came for entertainment, and now there's a body, so they leave. Nobody stays. Except Zarathustra. He kneels next to the dying man. He speaks to him gently in a surprisingly tender moment. He tells him that his soul will be dead even sooner than his body, so there's nothing left to fear. And when the man dies, Zarathustra picks up the corpse himself and carries it out of town to bury it, because no one else will. That's the real opening image of the book, not a triumphant declaration, a man alone with a body nobody else wanted to look at. If you're paying attention, that's basically the whole book in miniature. Zarathustra keeps trying to give people something real. They keep choosing the spectacle instead, and he keeps staying present with the wreckage anyway. The town he walks into is literally called the Motley Cow, which is such a strange name, but it's a brilliant, somewhat biting metaphor for the herd mentality. A cow is docile, it chews the cud, it's domestic and predictable. The crowd in the Motley Cow is standing there looking up at this tightrope walker, a man attempting something incredibly dangerous, trying to cross an abyss. Zarathustra uses that exact image. He says man is a rope over an abyss, a dangerous crossing. He is offering them a spiritual mirror, but they don't see it. The crowd doesn't see a metaphor for human transcendence. They just see a carnival act. They just want the dopamine hit of a spectacle. It feels uncomfortably modern, doesn't it? Picture a crowd watching someone having a terrible, life-altering meltdown on the street, and instead of helping, everyone just has their phones out, recording it for social media. They want the content, but the second it gets genuinely heavy, or tragic, or asks something real of them, they swipe away, they scatter. That's the human aversion to true psychological or physical peril. When the tightrope walker hits the earth, the entertainment value drops to zero, and the reality of mortality floods in. So they bounce. The crowd flees because they cannot face the consequences of the danger they were just cheering for. Which brings us to the jester. I really want to dig into this jester, because on the surface he's just a villain, right? A heckler who causes a man's death. That's the literal reading. But Zarathustra wants humanity to leap forward. He wants us to accelerate past our current state. Isn't the jester doing exactly that? A revolutionary force who refuses to be slowed down by the careful, balancing tightrope walker. So is the jester actually a dark reflection of Zarathustra himself? He is absolutely the shattered side of the philosophy. The jester represents reckless acceleration without foundation. Just speed for the sake of speed. He demands progress. He demands that we move forward. But he has absolute contempt for the struggle required to get there. He says forward, lame foot. He mocks the slow, agonizing process of balancing. He's skipping the hard part. Nietzsche is deeply aware of this danger in his own thought. He knows his ideas could easily be twisted into a justification for trampling the weak in the name of progress or greatness, which, spoiler alert, history definitely did. The jester is what happens when you take the demand for a higher humanity and strip away all the care, the patience, and the profound responsibility that must accompany it. When the tightrope walker falls, Zarathustra doesn't mock him. He honors him. He tells the dying man, "You made danger your vocation. There is nothing contemptible in that." And he physically carries the body into the woods, puts it in a hollow tree to keep the wolves away, and buries it. It's an incredibly tender moment. It totally shatters the caricature of Nietzsche as some cold, unfeeling advocate for brutality. But it also changes Zarathustra's entire game plan. He realizes the Motley Cow isn't going to work. He can't just shout deep truths at people who are looking for a circus. He realizes the herd cannot be taught. If you speak to everyone, you're speaking to no one. The masses will only ever consume your ideas as a passing fad or a source of amusement. To enact real change, to foster the kind of human being who can actually cross the abyss, he needs individuals. He needs companions who are willing to break away from the herd. And to explain how an individual actually breaks away, he lays out a roadmap, the metamorphoses, the psychology of spiritual transformation. Now, the part you've probably heard of, the 3 metamorphoses of the spirit: camel, lion, child. The famous trio. The camel is the spirit that kneels down and loads itself up. Duty, obligation, carrying what's heavy because you were taught that's what strength looks like. The lion is what happens when the camel finally gets out into the desert alone and something in it snaps. The lion's job is to fight a dragon called Thou Shalt, this giant symbol of every inherited rule and value. It's the Great Rebellion. The lion says no. It claims its own freedom, but everyone stops the story there. Like the lion is the finish line. Here's what gets left out almost every single time, and this is the critical part. The lion cannot create new values. It can only clear the ground. It can say no with tremendous force, but it cannot say a new yes. That's explicitly what the book says. The lion is necessary, but it's not the end state. A person who stays a lion forever becomes someone who's very good at rejecting things and very bad at building anything to replace them. We all know people like that. Think about how many people you know who are excellent at tearing down every system, every relationship, every belief, but have nothing to offer once the wreckage clears. That's a lion stuck mid-transformation. The child is the final stage. Innocence, forgetting, a new beginning. The capacity to say yes and to create your own values from scratch, like a game you're playing for the first time. The child doesn't fight the dragon. The child doesn't even remember the dragon existed. The psychological accuracy of these stages is staggering when you map them onto a human life. We all begin as camels, or at least we should. The camel is the phase of inheriting culture, language, morality, and tradition. You cannot bypass the camel. If you don't absorb the weight of your culture, if you don't discipline yourself to carry heavy burdens, you have no substance. You're just floating. The camel asks, "What is the heaviest thing, so I may take it upon me and rejoice in my strength?" And it waves into dirty water if it is the water of truth. You can see this so clearly in modern life, especially in our relationship to work and expectations. The modern camel is the person climbing the corporate ladder, working 80 hours a week, burning out entirely, but feeling a grim sense of pride in the exhaustion. Hustle culture, because society, the dragon of thou shalt, told them that this level of suffering is the only metric of success. Or it's the person carrying the crushing weight of religious or familial expectations, doing everything perfectly by the book, but feeling entirely hollow inside. They are loaded up with luggage that doesn't belong to them. Eventually, if that spirit has enough vitality, the weight becomes intolerable. The camel wanders into the loneliest desert, meaning a place of internal isolation where the external applause of society no longer reaches, and it transforms into the lion. It fights back. The lion's entire existence is predicated on negation. It looks at the golden scales of the dragon. Each scale represents a millennia-old value, a divine command, a societal norm, and the lion's only function is to roar, "I will not." It steals freedom for itself, but the trap of the lion is so seductive. We live in an era that absolutely worships the lion. The entire internet is basically a giant ecosystem designed to reward lions. It's the cynical critic who can flawlessly deconstruct a movie, a political system, or a philosophy, pointing out exactly why everything is flawed, problematic, or stupid. It's the takedown, and we applaud them. We say, wow, they totally destroyed that person in the debate. But Nietzsche is warning us that if your entire identity is based on deconstruction, you are spiritually stunted. The deconstructionist phase is a dead end if it becomes your permanent residence. If your whole personality is just being anti-establishment, anti-religion, or anti-mainstream, you are still entirely defined by the thing you hate. You are letting the dragon dictate your existence by simply doing the exact opposite of what it says. You haven't escaped the dragon. You are tethered to it in reverse. The lion creates an empty space. It secures the right to create, but the lion itself cannot create because creation requires love, and the lion only knows how to fight. So we have to become the child, a self-propelling wheel. Nietzsche calls it a sacred yes. This concept reminds me heavily of research drawing parallels between Nietzsche and Zen Buddhism. There's this idea in Zen where the first step of enlightenment is breaking away from illusions. That's the lion fighting the dragon. You gain your autonomy, but the final step of true enlightenment is what they call the emancipation from the emancipation. You have to free yourself from your own rebellion. You have to let go of the ego that prides itself on being the brave rebel who fought the dragon. You just become empty, present, and playful. Playful is the key word. The child isn't sitting on the beach plotting how to tear down other people's sandcastles because sandcastles represent some outdated architectural norm. The child doesn't care about the other sandcastles. The child is just joyfully building their own weird sandcastle from scratch, fully absorbed in the act of creation, totally unburdened by history. The child says yes to life on its own terms. It creates values not out of resentment for the past, but out of an overflowing abundance of life in the present. This is the ultimate goal of Zarathustra's teaching. The final metamorphosis, the individual who reaches this stage of the child, is the one capable of giving birth to the highest human potential, which brings us to the core concept Zarathustra is trying to introduce to the world. The concept that has been more misunderstood and weaponized than almost any other idea in philosophy, the Ubermensch, the Overman. Let's do some historical cleanup here, because the baggage attached to this word is horrific. People hear Ubermensch, and they immediately think of biological supremacy, eugenics, fascism, and the Third Reich. We have to address how the book got there and what the book actually says, because they are two entirely different things. The historical distortion is one of the great tragedies of literature. When Nietzsche suffered his complete mental collapse in 1889 in Turin, he lived for another 11 years in a vegetative state. And during this time, his sister, Elizabeth Forster Nietzsche, took control of his estate. She created the Nietzsche archive. Elizabeth was a virulent anti-Semite and a German nationalist, everything Nietzsche explicitly despised. He had cut ties with her, precisely because of these views, but once he was incapacitated, she aggressively edited his unpublished notes, forged letters, and marketed his work to align with her proto-fascist ideology. It's identity theft on a historical scale. Decades later, the Nazis found this curated, weaponized version of his philosophy incredibly useful. They stripped the Ubermensch of its psychological and spiritual meaning and turned it into a racial and political caricature. But if we look strictly at the book of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the Overman has absolutely nothing to do with politics or race. Zarathustra says the Overman is the meaning of the earth. He is talking about a state of psychological self-overcoming. Remember, Nietzsche declared that God is dead. The old religious frameworks that gave human suffering meaning by promising a reward in the afterlife had collapsed under the weight of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. Science kind of broke the old mythology, and the danger was that without God, humanity would slide into nihilism, believing that nothing matters at all. The Overman is his solution, the antidote to nihilism. It is the human being who does not need to look up at a transcendent heaven to find meaning. Instead, they embrace the earth, the physical body, the chaos of existence, and they create a life so rich, so deeply affirmed, that it justifies itself. They make their own meaning. The Overman is the artist of their own life, taking their darkest, most chaotic impulses and organizing them into something beautiful and powerful. And one of the biggest roadblocks to becoming this Overman, according to Zarathustra, is the state. He hates the state. He calls it the coldest of all cold monsters. Now, to be clear, this isn't a political stance on modern government, just what Nietzsche wrote. But his critique is fascinating because he views the state, any mass political apparatus, as a machine that fundamentally wants to level everyone down. It wants everyone to be the same. It wants conformity. It tells you, I, the state, am the people. And Zarathustra calls that a lie. The state is a mechanism of the herd. It requires predictable, manageable citizens. It offers them security, safety, and a prepackaged identity in exchange for their individual agency. The state tells you what to value, who to hate, and what is considered virtuous. For Zarathustra, relying on the state to give your life meaning is just replacing the dead god with a new bureaucratic idol. It's just a new religion. It prevents the arduous, lonely work of self-creation. And if the state succeeds completely, if we hand over all our struggles in exchange for absolute security and comfort, we arrive at the absolute opposite of the Overman. We arrive at what Zarathustra calls the last man. This is the part of the book that feels like it was written yesterday. It's eerie how well it holds up. Zarathustra is standing in the marketplace, and he decides to try a different tactic. Since the crowd didn't care about the Overman, he decides to describe the most pathetic, stagnant, uninspiring version of humanity he can imagine, hoping to disgust them. He describes the last man, and the last man doesn't look like an evil villain. The last man is just what happens when comfort is always available and difficulty is permanently optional. The last man represents the end of human aspiration. They have eliminated extreme poverty, disease, and major conflict. But in doing so, they have eliminated greatness. They traded greatness for comfort. Zarathustra says they have invented happiness, and then they just blink. They don't have deep passions. They don't take risks. They seek mild pleasures for the day and mild pleasures for the night, always careful of their health. They think anyone who feels intensely or wants to struggle for a higher goal is insane. They just want a frictionless existence. Reading this, it's hard not to picture a guy in sweatpants scrolling an algorithm perfectly curated to never show him a disagreeing opinion. Doom scrolling. Same-day delivery, so you never have to experience the friction of waiting. Numbing out on a couch with endless streaming content, taking a pill for every minor discomfort, and avoiding any conversation that might cause social friction. He's not evil, he's just avoiding life. The last man isn't an evil dictator. He's a guy who thinks avoiding all friction is the ultimate definition of winning at life. The terror of the last man is that it sounds nice, and that is exactly what happens in the book. Zarathustra describes this complacent, risk-free, thoroughly domesticated existence, fully expecting the crowd to recoil in horror. But they don't. Instead, the crowd cheers. They interrupt him and yell, "Give us this last man, Zarathustra. Turn us into these last men. You can keep your Overmen." That is the moment of Zarathustra's true despair. He realizes humanity's natural gravity pulls them toward comfort. But let's challenge Nietzsche on this for a second. Is he just romanticizing suffering? If the last man is basically just a modern person living in a climate-controlled apartment with modern medicine, is Nietzsche saying we shouldn't have comfortable beds or anesthetics because it makes us soft? Does he just want us to suffer for the sake of being edgy? No, it's not suffering for suffering's sake. He isn't advocating for meaningless torture. He is observing a fundamental psychological and biological reality. Growth requires resistance, like going to the gym. A muscle only grows when it is subjected to micro tears under the strain of heavy weights. Nietzsche understands that the human spirit operates on the same principle. If you remove all friction, all danger, all necessity for struggle, the spirit atrophies. It just shrinks. The last man is spiritually atrophied. To give birth to a dancing star, as Zarathustra puts it, requires chaos and immense internal pressure. It requires the exertion of what he calls the will to power. Now, the will to power, this is another concept we have to rescue from the cultural wreckage, because the marketing version of this phrase sounds like a Gordon Gekko. Wall Street, greed is good manifesto. Step on everyone to get to the top. It sounds like the will to dominate others, to crush your competition, to be a tyrant or a billionaire CEO. But how does Nietzsche actually define it in the book? The will to power is the fundamental creative driving force of all life. It is not primarily about dominating others. It is the drive to overcome oneself. Self-mastery. It is the instinct to expand, to grow, to shape the environment around you rather than just passively reacting to it. In the chapter on self-overcoming, Zarathustra says that wherever he found the living, he found the will to power. Even a tree growing in a dense forest exerts the will to power by pushing its branches higher to reach the sunlight. So it's the drive towards self-mastery. The artist wrestling with a blank canvas for months to create a masterpiece is exercising the will to power. The athlete pushing their body past its limits is exercising it. Even what we traditionally call the will to truth, the drive of scientists and philosophers to map out the universe, Nietzsche unmasks that as a refined subset of the will to power. It is an attempt by the human mind to make this terrifying, chaotic, unpredictable universe thinkable and manageable. We organize reality into scientific laws so we can master it. It's all a creative exertion. The last man has abandoned the will to power in favor of mere preservation, but the person striving for the Overman uses their will to power to constantly tear down their old self and build a stronger one. If the will to power is this great, uplifting, creative force, what is Zarathustra actually fighting against? Because he doesn't have a traditional villain in this book. He isn't fighting a corrupt king or an evil sorcerer. His ultimate battle is internal. He calls it the spirit of gravity. The spirit of gravity is the absolute antithesis of the Overman. If the Overman is light, dancing, and constantly ascending, the spirit of gravity is the force that pulls everything down. Zarathustra personifies it as a dwarf or a mole, sitting heavily on his shoulder. He says the dwarf is dripping lead into his ear. It's a brutal image, dripping liquid lead into the brain. It's the physical sensation of severe despair. It's the voice of absolute nihilism. The dwarf whispers to him, "Zarathustra, you threw yourself up high, but every thrown stone must fall." It's that exhausting internal monologue that tells you, why even try? Why bother building anything? Why bother loving anyone when we're all just going to die and the universe doesn't care and you're just a highly evolved ape on a rock in space? It is the crushing weight of existential futility. It is the sheer exhaustion of carrying the burden of existence. The spirit of gravity convinces you that life is a tragedy to be endured. It demands that you take everything with absolute grim seriousness. For thousands of years, religion and philosophy have operated under the spirit of gravity. Wisdom was always depicted as a man with a heavy beard, solemn, ascetic, suffering, carrying the weight of the world. Seriousness was the marker of truth. So how does Zarathustra fight this dwarf? He doesn't sit down and write a dense logical counterargument. He doesn't try to debate the dwarf using formal reasoning. He says one kills, not by anger, but by laughter. This is one of the most radical shifts in the history of philosophy. Nietzsche proposes that laughter is the ultimate weapon of the strong. How do you defeat nihilism? You laugh at it. Laughter requires a letting go of the ego. It requires a release of physical and mental tension. When you laugh, you are acknowledging the absurdity of a situation without being crushed by it. Think about how laughter actually functions physically. You cannot be in a state of sheer heavy panic and genuinely laugh at the same time. Laughter breaks the physiological hold of fear. It physically changes you. Zarathustra says the hardest thing for these exalted heroes, these tense, rigid, hyper-serious intellectuals, is to stand with relaxed muscles and an unharnessed will, to just be light, to be nimble. Wisdom shouldn't look like a guy carrying a boulder. It should look like someone dancing on the edge of a cliff. Dancing and laughter shatter the illusion of permanence and heaviness. If you can look into the abyss of a meaningless universe and laugh, the abyss loses its power over you. The spirit of gravity cannot survive in the presence of genuine life-affirming joy. But here's a fair pushback. Zarathustra talks a phenomenal game about dancing and laughing and being light. But if you read the book, the guy is a wreck. He is constantly weeping. He sighs heavily. He runs away from people. He isolates himself. If laughter is the cure, it doesn't seem to be working for him most of the time. Why is he so utterly miserable? That is the tragic tension at the heart of Zarathustra's character. He knows the goal is laughter and lightness, but he is anchored to the ground by his own compassion, his pity for people. He is a deeply sensitive man, and he keeps getting dragged down by the misery of others. He looks at humanity, he sees their potential, and he sees how broken they are. And his pity for them paralyzes him, it traps him. His struggle against his own pity leads us into the strangest, most surreal section of the book, Part 4, the part he had to print himself. Part 4 genuinely reads like a fever dream. It's incredibly bizarre. Zarathustra is back in his mountain cave, and he starts encountering this bizarre parade of characters wandering around his domain. He calls them the higher men. These are supposed to be the best examples of humanity left in the world after the death of God, the elite. There's a pope who is out of work because God died. There are 2 kings walking around with a donkey. There's a sorcerer, a voluntary beggar, a scientist who studies leeches. And they are drawn to Zarathustra's cave, but they aren't triumphant overmen. They are profoundly broken. They are all suffering from what Zarathustra calls the great disgust. The higher men represent the absolute limits of the old world. They are the intellectual, spiritual, and political elites. They are smart enough to realize that the old frameworks, religion, traditional morality, the state, are hollow. They've seen through the illusion. They know God is dead. They are lions who have successfully slain the dragon, but they do not have the strength to become children. They cannot create new values. They're stuck mid-transformation. So they are left wandering in a state of cynical despair, sick with a nausea over how small and petty humanity has become. They bring all of their intellectual baggage and their depression right to Zarathustra's doorstep. And among them is the most shocking character in the entire book, the ugliest man. Such a powerful figure. Zarathustra is walking through a desolate, dead valley, literally called the Valley of Death, and he finds this creature sitting on the ground. He is so hideous that Zarathustra physically recoils and tries to walk away. But the ugliest man speaks, and he reveals a massive, terrifying secret. He is the one who killed God, and we have to look closely at the reason he gives for doing it. Because it is a masterclass in psychology. The ugliest man didn't kill God because he read Charles Darwin, or because he became a rational atheist. No, it's way more personal than that. He killed God because God's pity was intolerable. He says God saw everything. God saw all of man's ugliness, his hidden shame, his absolute wretchedness. God looked at this deformed, suffering man with a gaze of infinite, bleeding pity, and the ugliest man could not endure being the object of that gaze. The pity was humiliating. It stripped him of whatever tiny shred of dignity he had left, so he took revenge and murdered the supreme witness. It is an incredibly sharp critique of how we view compassion. Nietzsche is arguing that pity, specifically a kind of condescending, weeping sympathy for someone else's suffering, can actually be an act of profound cruelty because it makes them a victim. When you pity someone, you are inherently placing yourself above them. You are cementing them into the role of a victim. You are saying you are weak, and I am the strong one looking down on your tragedy. The ugliest man preferred to be hideous, isolated, and godless, rather than be bathed in a divine pity that made him feel permanently small and wretched. It totally flips the moral script. We are taught that pity is the highest virtue. Nietzsche says no. Pity drains the vitality out of both the person feeling it and the person receiving it. And this whole dynamic plays out in an incredibly strange scene later in the cave. The festival. Zarathustra leaves these higher men alone for a bit to go get some fresh air. When he comes back, he catches them holding a festival, but they aren't celebrating their new freedom. They aren't trying to become overmen. They are worshipping the literal donkey that the kings brought with them. Literally worshipping an ass. They are burning incense, feeding the ass wine, kneeling before it, and the donkey is just braying. The ass festival is a blatant, blasphemous parody of the Christian Mass. But the philosophical point is devastating. Nietzsche is showing the desperate, almost biological human need to worship something. Even these higher men, the smartest people on earth, who literally know that God is dead and that religion is a human invention, cannot bear the weight of standing alone. The second Zarathustra leaves them to their own devices, the existential vertigo kicks in, and they immediately invent a new, ridiculous idol just to feel the comfort of kneeling and belonging to a congregation. It's like watching highly educated, secular, modern people suddenly join a bizarre internet cult, or adopt a rigid, dogmatic political ideology that functions exactly like a religion. They need someone to tell them what to do. Is Nietzsche just using these characters to dunk on the intellectuals of his time? Is this just satire, or is there a deeper narrative purpose here? It's a profound test for Zarathustra himself. The soothsayer explicitly warned him earlier in the book, Your final sin, your ultimate temptation, will be pity for the higher man. Throughout Part 4, Zarathustra is constantly pulled away from his own joy, his own desire to dance in the light, by the agonizing cries of these broken men in his cave. He wants to save them, he wants to heal them, but he has to learn that he cannot carry them across the abyss. If he sinks into pity for them, he will be dragged right back down by the spirit of gravity. He has to overcome his own compassion if he is ever going to reach his goal. It's such a lonely path. And you can see how isolated this makes him when you look at who his true companions are. Because he doesn't really connect with the higher men, he tolerates them, he feeds them, he talks to them, but they aren't his equals. They are a burden, his only true companions in his mountain cave, and this is a detail that runs through the entire structure of the book from page 1, are two animals, the eagle and the snake. The animals are highly symbolic. The eagle represents soaring pride, flying in the highest, brightest, thinnest air. The snake represents ancient wisdom, moving close to the earth, understanding the dark, hidden roots of things. Pride and wisdom are the tools Zarathustra uses to navigate his solitude. But these animals aren't just symbolic props. In the narrative, they are the only beings who actually understand him. They speak to him. They comfort him when the human crowds below laugh at him, and when the higher men exhaust him. And this brings us right back to the architecture of loneliness we talked about at the very beginning. Look at the structural rhythm of this entire book. Zarathustra descends the mountain with a heart full of love, wanting to teach. He tries to connect. He gets rejected, misunderstood, mocked, or dragged down by pity. So he retreats back up the mountain to the cold solitude of his cave and his animals to heal. Descent, rejection, retreat, over and over again. That heartbeat of isolation is the core rhythm of the book. And when you map that rhythm onto Nietzsche's real life in 1883 and 1884, it's staggering how perfectly the cycle of descent and retreat mirrors his reality. He would cautiously try to share his new ideas with the few friends he had left, or he would publish a book, desperately hoping for connection, hoping someone would understand what he was trying to do. The response would be silence, confusion, or outright rejection. So he would retreat back into his solitary wanderings, pacing endlessly through the Swiss Alps in Sils Maria or the Italian coast, dealing with his physical agony, entirely alone. The loneliness isn't just a clever literary device to make Zarathustra look like a mysterious hermit. It is the very core of the book. It is Nietzsche's lived experience bleeding onto the page. Now, here's a fair devil's advocate question. If his entire philosophy of the Overman, this idea of a supreme, self-justifying, solitary creator, is born out of this intense, agonizing personal isolation, doesn't that make the whole concept just an elaborate coping mechanism? Is this the ultimate intellectual case of sour grapes? Something like, I couldn't get a date with Lou Salomé, my friends abandoned me, my stomach hurts all the time, and my books won't sell, so actually I'm a superior being, and all of you are just the pathetic herd. It is the most common and frankly the most devastating critique leveled at Nietzsche. It is incredibly easy to psychoanalyze him and write off the Ubermensch as a grand defensive fantasy for a lonely, sickly man who felt powerless in reality, and there is undoubtedly an element of psychological compensation happening. Nietzsche was human, but to dismiss the philosophy as mere coping is to underestimate the absolute rigor of his thought, because Nietzsche pushes past the fantasy. If he just wanted a coping mechanism, he would have written a book where Zarathustra eventually brainwashes the world and becomes king, but he doesn't. Instead, he forces Zarathustra, and by extension himself, to face a thought experiment so heavy, so terrifying, and so awful that it would instantly crush any fragile, fake psychological defense mechanism. Eternal recurrence, the heaviest burden, the most abysmal thought. In the book, it is the animals, the eagle and the snake, who declare Zarathustra the teacher of the eternal return. This is the core of his entire philosophy. The concept is that time is a flat circle. Everything repeats. You must live this exact life, with all its pains, all its rejections, all its humiliations, over and over again for eternity. Nothing will be changed, not a single detail. Not a single sigh, not a single migraine, not a single heartbreak, not a single embarrassing failure. Every spider, every patch of moonlight, every moment of agony you have ever experienced will return in the exact same sequence, forever. It is the ultimate, uncompromising test of affirmation. If you are just using a coping mechanism, if you are just pretending to be strong while secretly hating your life, the idea of the eternal return will destroy you because you can't fake your way through eternity. It removes the one comfort that sufferers have. The hope that it will eventually end, or that things will be different in the future or in an afterlife. Can you say yes to a life that includes immense, meaningless suffering, knowing you will have to repeat it infinitely? When Zarathustra first truly confronts this abysmal thought, it literally breaks him. He falls down like a dead man and lies in his cave, unresponsive for 7 days. Totally paralyzed, he is terrified of it. The idea of repeating the smallness, the pettiness, and the misery of human existence forever is physically nauseating, and he communicates this horror through one of the most intense, visceral, nightmarish scenes in the whole book. Zarathustra recounts a vision he had. He sees a young shepherd writhing on the ground, gagging, choking, his face completely distorted in terror. Why? Because a heavy black snake has crawled into the shepherd's mouth while he was sleeping and bitten down on his throat. The snake in the throat is the physical manifestation of the eternal recurrence. It is a suffocating, choking realization that the worst pain you have ever felt, the deepest trauma of your life, will return and you cannot escape it. It is choking off his air, choking off his life force. Zarathustra runs over to the shepherd, grabs the snake and tries to pull it out, but he can't. It's stuck tight in the throat. Pulling won't work. So Zarathustra screams at the shepherd. He yells, "Bite! Bite its head off!" The ultimate violent act of will. The shepherd bites down with all his might. He severs the snake's head, spits it out, and then he jumps up. But he is no longer just a frightened shepherd. He laughs, but it is a superhuman laugh. The book says no man on earth ever laughed as he laughed. The mechanism of overcoming here is crucial. You cannot gently pull the horror out of your throat. You cannot reason with the eternal return of suffering. You cannot politely negotiate with your deepest traumas. You must overcome it through a violent, decisive, total act of will. You must bite down on reality. You must actively claim it as your own. The shepherd's laughter is the laughter of the Overman. It is the joyous, triumphant, almost terrifying sound of someone who has stared into the absolute worst the universe has to offer, conquered the heaviest thought imaginable, and found a way to be light. This is what Nietzsche calls amor fati, the love of fate. It is not enough to just grit your teeth and bear the eternal recurrence. You can't just passively accept it with a stoic shrug. You must actively love it. You have to want it. And remarkably, in the narrative, it's not just Zarathustra who reaches this state. Toward the end of the book, during a late-night feast with the broken higher men, it is the ugliest man, the character who suffered the most, the one who was so wretched he killed God to escape being pitied, who finally embraces this concept. In a moment of sudden, overwhelming clarity, he cries out, "Was that life? For Zarathustra's sake, well then, once more." That is the ultimate victory cry in Nietzsche's philosophy. The ugliest man, despite all his deformity, despite a life of absolute misery, finds a single moment of such intense joy, such profound connection and affirmation that he decides it justifies everything else. He is willing to repeat his entire miserable existence, all the pain and rejection, just to experience that one moment of joy again. He learns to bless his life completely and without condition. Let's bring this directly to you, because this is where it actually matters. If the demon of eternal recurrence visited you tonight and said, "You have to live this exact life over again," reliving your worst grief over and over, reliving the phone call when you found out you lost someone, reliving your deepest, most shameful humiliation, reliving a chronic illness. Is Nietzsche actually saying we have to be grateful for our deepest traumas? That feels almost cruel to ask of someone. He is not saying you should be grateful for the trauma as an isolated event. He isn't asking you to pretend that pain feels good. He is forcing you to recognize that your life is an inextricably woven fabric. You cannot mathematically isolate the joy from the grief. The person you are in your highest, most beautiful, most powerful moments was forged directly by the fires of your deepest traumas. Your capacity for empathy, your strength, your specific lens on the world, it all requires the pain that seeded it. If you pull out the thread of your suffering, you unravel the entire tapestry of your joy. To truly say yes to your triumphs, you must logically and emotionally say yes to the tragedies that built the person experiencing those triumphs. Embracing this total package, refusing to edit out the ugly parts, is the final step of amor fati, which brings us to the end of the book. After all this intense struggle, after the snake in the throat, and the laughter, and the ugliest man shouting once more, you would expect a tidy ending. You would expect Zarathustra to finally complete his transformation, to become the fully realized Overman, and to float off into a state of perfect, unbothered bliss. You'd expect the hero's journey to conclude with total mastery. But that is deliberately not what Nietzsche gives us. It's morning. The final scene of the book. Zarathustra steps out of his cave into the dawn light, and finally, the sign he's been waiting years for arrives. A massive flock of doves surrounds him in a cloud of love, fluttering around his head. And then a mighty golden lion emerges from the woods and rests its head gently on Zarathustra's knee. Supreme strength and perfect peace united. The sign has come. He says, "My children are near." It is a moment of profound, quiet beauty. The raging storm of the book finally stills. Looking at the lion and the doves, Zarathustra realizes that his agonizing pity for the higher men, the broken people sleeping inside his cave, was his last sin, his last tether to the dwarf. It was his final temptation, the last thing keeping him tied to the spirit of gravity. He leaves them behind in the cave. He steps forward. But notice carefully, there is no final declaration that he has crossed the finish line. The becoming is unfinished. He leaves his cave glowing and strong like a morning sun, but he is still searching. He asks himself, "My suffering and my pity, what of them? For do I aspire after happiness? I aspire after my work." Nietzsche is not handing you a finished product. He isn't giving you a neat 3-step life hack plan to becoming an Overman so you can sit back on a beach and relax forever. He is handing you a man who is still in the middle of the grueling work, and he does it on purpose. There is no final arrival. There is only the next descent. That is the ultimate honesty of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. To claim that you have permanently enlightened, perfectly balanced, and totally immune to suffering is to deceive yourself and to slip right back into the last man.